Hello, sixth graders. So we're at chapter 7, the second to the last chapter in the book, and we're coming off of that incredible revelation about the guard and his love for the woman in Denmark. So we've got that information as we launch into chapter 7. Just open up your books and follow along. Here we go. The wind was blowing icy cold, and the snow was falling so thickly that David could not see his hand in front of him. He knew he had very little strength left, and yet he struggled on, step by step. He was determined not to die. He would go on and on until he came to Denmark and found the woman who must be his mother. He would let nothing stand in his way now. Neither snow nor cold nor mountains would stop him. He was David, a boy on the run, but one who now knew where he was going. The day before, he had had a lift in a car from Lugano, but when he reached a place called Fado, the driver would not go any farther. The weather was bad, he said, and the paths would be closed. David had slept in a stable outside of town, and that morning he had trudged on, the road climbing up and up, and the air growing colder and colder until at last the snow came. The Danish woman had told him he could come back to her when he returned from Rome, when she returned from Rome. She had said if there were any way in which she could help him, he must ask her, and she had added that if he did not care for the circus and had no near relatives to go to, she would be pleased to have him live with her. But David had only half listened to what she was saying. Fortunately, he was well used to hiding his thoughts and feelings. He had answered politely and remembered to thank her, and had behaved just as if nothing had happened. And he had told her he had an uncle in the circus who was very nice to him. He told her all the lies he could lay tongue to, and he no longer felt it was wrong. He had to get to Denmark, and he would have to lie himself out of any situation that stood in his way or might put them in his tracks. Hadn't the Frenchman talked about investigating his circumstances? Nothing and no one should stop him now. Yet he knew himself that the Danish signora would have understood if he could have told her. He had asked her name. He had asked the name of the camp guard, and it was the man. David understood everything now, or nearly everything. The man had saved the woman's life because he liked her in the way grown-up people like those they wanted to marry. He had not saved her husband because he had hated him for being her husband. He had saved David's life because he was her child. He had not told her the child was still alive, however, perhaps because he could only get papers for one, though David did not think that could be the whole reason. They always wanted revenge. Because the woman did not care for him, the man had gotten his revenge by turning David into a boy from a concentration camp. Yes, that's how it was. And yet the man had seen to it that he did not die. He had given him milk and vitamins, and had always insisted that the boy knows nothing. David began to understand a lot of things now. They had let Johannes starve and freeze and made him work, even when he fell ill. But apart from that, they had not ill-treated him, as they had the other prisoners. And David had believed that they could not lay hands on Johannes when he looked them straight in the eye. But he now saw that that was not the only thing. The man had seen to it that Johannes should be there to look after David. Johannes said that the older one grew, the more complicated and involved one's feelings became, and sometimes they were quite opposed to one another, as, for example, when you would like to stay awake but felt you wanted to fall asleep. At the same time, that was how the man had felt. He had hated David because of his mother, who would have nothing to do with him, and at the same time he had looked after him, also because of his mother, and in the end he had let him escape. That was how David himself felt, too. He hated the man, both because he was bad and because he had made him into a boy who seemed odd to other people and would never be able to shake himself entirely free of the concentration camp. Yet at the same time, David could not hate him wholeheartedly because in the end he had let him go. No one had bribed the man. There was no one to do it since nobody knew of David's existence. And if you knew anything about them, then you knew too the danger the man had risked in letting a prisoner escape, and yet he had done it. David's steps grew slower and slower. He had lost all feeling in his feet now, and he was cold to the bone. The snow continued falling. He felt an irresistible urge to lie down, if only for a moment, but he dared not give way. He might die of cold out in the snow. He could no longer follow the road. Everything was covered with snow, and he could see nothing at all through the thickly falling flakes. There had not been a signpost for a long time. At last his mind grew numb, and as on the road to Salonika, his feet carried him along quite unconsciously. Suddenly there was nowhere in front of him to set foot that was about to take the next step forward. Suddenly there was nowhere in front of him to set the foot that was about to take the next step forward. David threw himself backward, fell and rolled over. A precipice. He had nearly walked over the edge. Before he had become so exhausted that he had just let his feet carry him along of their own accord. He had been well aware of the danger. Before the snow had begun falling, he had seen how easily it was to miss one's footing and go hurling down the mountainside. He would have to think what he was doing. Not for 1 second could he afford to relax his attention. He no longer dared to walk, and so he crawled onward on all fours, feeling his way carefully with his hands to make sure he was not near the edge of the precipice. He did not know how many hours passed in this way. He ached all over, and the snow continued to swirl about him in a howling gale that seemed to cut right into his head. He was blinded and deafened, and the pain of his aching body grew so intense that he felt he could not last another minute. It was worse than anything he could think of, worse than the camp, worse than them, and he could not call on God to help him, for the words were blown away inside his head, swept away into the howling gale and the blinding white hell all around him. There was no way out but to die. David struck his head against something hard. He fell, and then it snowed no more. A voice cried, "What kind of young thief this staggered about in this sort of weather?" With difficulty David opened his eyes sufficiently to realize he had come across one of them. Then he knew no more. That winter was the longest David had ever experienced. The farmer was an evil-hearted man. David had escaped from the wind and the snow, only to be treated like a prisoner in this man's house. It was the stable door he had struck his head against, and that stable became his shelter for the winter, and not very good shelter either. All day long he had to work and slave as hard as he could, and a bit harder if possible. The farmer was just like one of them. He used threats to force David to work and said he would hand him over to the police if he did not obey. David had now learned how the members of a family spoke to one another pleasantly and smilingly, but there was nothing like that here. The farmer was cold and brutal, even to his wife and 2 children. But David could not feel any particular sympathy for them, for the wife was a clumsy, silent woman with a sharp edge to her tongue, and as for the children, David had never thought it possible for anyone who was still a child to be so bad. The boy was the younger, and he looked just like his father. He had stiff, unattractive, straw-colored hair and very pale blue eyes. When he played, it was always the same story. He either destroyed something or got into mischief. Whenever he had a chance, he was cruel to animals. But he knew he would get a beating if he was found out. Not that the farmer had anything against violence as such, but the animals were worth money, and so they must not be ill-treated. Yet the boy could not keep his hands off them. His greatest pleasure was causing pain to a living creature. Johannes had once said that violence and cruelty were just a stupid person's way of making himself felt, because it was easier to use your hands to strike a blow than to use your brain to find a logical and just solution to a problem. Nevertheless, it made David feel sick to see the boy's cruelty, and the girl was not much better. True, she was not cruel to the beasts, but she was not kind either. When David considered that she was about the same age as Maria, he was shocked at the difference between them. There was Maria, like a flower in the grace of her movements, with a laugh like the tinkle of slender, polished glasses touching together. Maria, with her ready smile, full of affection that she lavished on everyone, grown-ups, children, animals, even on a runaway boy. And then this girl who did nothing to please anyone, not even her own mother. They all treated David like a dog. They threw his food to him and called him names, but they did not lay hands on him. They had left him lying in the stable until he had recovered, and then they had put him to work. But when during one of the first days he spent there the farmer had been about to strike him, his wife had told him to let the boy be. She had said, "You're always so stupid, Hans. He can work. I'll not meddle with that, and the stable's good enough for him. A young thief like him knows which side his bread's buttered, and he'll not make a fuss about that. But if you lay hands on him, he'll murder us all in our beds, and you can tell by the look of him. And the youngsters that do it well to keep out of his way if they don't want to get beaten up. That you may be sure of. That you may be sure of. You've got free labor for the winter, and that'll have to do. Then we can hand him over to the police in the spring." David thought they were all stupid, wicked but stupid as well. If they had touched him, he would have been forced to go out into the snow again and freeze to death, but he would never have used physical violence against them. He hated them, and he would rather have let himself be killed than be like them. In a way it was amusing. Yes, amusing was the right word. Apart from hitting him, they intended to see to it that life was made as wretched for him as they could make it, and yet it was still to his advantage. He knew now that he could never have lasted through the winter tramping the roads. He would have died of hunger and cold. At least he had shelter where he was, and food every day. The stable was cold, and sometimes the snow was blown into drifts until it lay as high as the roof outside. But as it hardened, the stable grew warmer inside. The animals added a little to the warmth. He was not given much food, only dry bread or cold scraps, and yet he had more to eat than he had been used to in the camp, and it tasted no worse, sometimes, in fact, a little better. They thought they were making him suffer by leaving him to sleep alone in the dark stable, but night was his pleasantest time. David was not afraid of the dark. There were only common, everyday objects about him, and the animals asleep. It seemed quite natural. The darkness altered nothing, and David was not frightened of it. What he was afraid of was people. At night time the stable was his. In the camp he had never been alone, and David liked to be left by himself to think in peace. Then the dog came. David had always thought of dogs as enemies, their tools. It was one of their pastimes to make the dogs bite the prisoners. Since his escape into Italy, he had of course noticed that good people kept dogs too, but he had always given them a wide berth, just in case they could tell where he came from, and then they would bite him. But shut up in the stable, he could not avoid the dog. It came one night when it was snowing hard and a gale was howling outside. David lay quite still and, much against his will, let it sniff all around him. The farmer and his family spoke a peculiar kind of German. Perhaps that was the reason David spoke to it in Italian. "I'm afraid of you," he said softly, in as steady a voice as he could muster. "You're sure to notice I come from a camp, and then you'll bite me, and there's nothing I can do about it." David could see the dog as it went on sniffing around him like a big black shadow against the darkness. Then it lay down by his side, pushing and turning until they were lying back to back. It yawned very loudly, and David felt its warm, moist breath. Then it gave a sigh and fell asleep. It did not bite him, and David was not nearly so cold in the night, for the dog was big and kept him warm. It was called King. It often growled at the farmer's children, and David knew it was not very fond of the farmer either, though he barely struck it, no doubt because it was a good sheepdog, and in the summer, when the animals were out to graze, he could not do without it. But whenever it saw David, it would wag its tail, and it went to sleep with him every night. David gradually began to grow fond of it. One evening, as he lay awake wondering if the winter would ever come to an end, he held his hand out to the dog when it came to lie down beside him. He did it without thinking. Perhaps he had missed it and wanted it to come and share its warmth with him. He found himself touching its head, feeling the roundness of its skull under his hand, and liking the firm, warm feel of it. The dog did not move, and David let his hand glide slowly over the dog's thick coat just once. Then he took his hand away and lay still again. The dog lifted its head and turned toward him, and David felt its warm, wet tongue carefully licking his hand. And so David and the dog became friends. But David was beginning to grow impatient. It seemed as if the winter would go on forever, and he wanted to be up and on his way, and on until he came to Denmark, where he would try to find the woman who had changed everything, so that he was no longer just a boy, wandering aimlessly and always appearing strange to other people, but one who knew where he was going. When he found her, he might perhaps learn not to seem strange and different, and to do it in such a way that he would still be himself. He tried to avoid taking it for granted that she would be glad he was still alive, for he obviously could not be sure she would. Since she had always assumed he was dead, she might find it difficult to get used to the idea that he was David. especially when he was so different from the other boys and knew so little of the world outside the concentration camp. But he was sure from her photograph that she would be a good woman, and clever, too. She would tell him what to do to avoid causing suspicion until he was sufficiently grown up for it not to matter any more if he chose to go his own way. Perhaps she would be able to find somewhere where he could work with kind, good-hearted people. He found it difficult not to let his thoughts run away with him. Now and then he would find himself in the middle of a wonderful, happy daydream where he would fancy she would be glad. She would see at once that he was David, and would want to love him just as the children's father and mother loved the children in the house. Then he would come to the end of his wanderings. He would have a place where he belonged, and he would be able to ask about all the things he did not know, and learn all he wanted to. She would say, "My son," when she spoke of him, and he would never have to be afraid again. And, as his thoughts ran on, he would tell himself that she was surrounded with fine things, and understood music, and loved and appreciated beauty. He thought of all the things he would be able to tell her. He would not want to say anything about the most dreadful things he had seen, but he would be able to talk about Johannes, and all that he had seen and learned since his escape, and about Maria, and all the things he had thought of. It would be like staying with Signora Hartmann, only much, much better, for now he would belong. There was a king in Denmark. Too, it was a free country. If it all turned out like that, there was nothing he could think of good enough to do in return for the God of green pastures and still waters. But it would not be quite like that, not quite so wonderful, probably. It would be good, though, and David longed for the winter to pass so that he could be on his way again. Then one morning the sun crept into the stable through a tiny little window high up under the roof, a window that had been covered with thick frost all the time he had been with the farmer. David's heart began to beat faster. As he lay there perfectly still, he had the impression that if he moved, that weak little ray of sunshine might disappear. He had not seen the sun for such a long time that he had almost forgotten its existence. It did not reach down to where he lay, and so he got up and slowly stretched his arms toward it. If he stretched as high as he could, he might be able to touch the pale little beam of light with his hand. Suddenly it was the most important thing in the world to reach up to the sunlight, but however hard he stretched, the sun would not reach farther than the tips of his fingers. David decided he would see if he could find something to do on the other side of the house that looked down into the valley, but the farmer was near him all the time, and he was not able to see anything. And that evening, as he lay awake, he heard the farmer push the great bar into place across the stable door. Then David knew that spring was on its way. It would come first to the valley below, and that was why the farmer had taken good care that David should have no opportunity of looking down there that day. He did not want him to see the signs of spring. Later it would come to the mountain pastures. David worked hard every day, and so the farmer would keep him imprisoned there as long as he could. And when he could no longer hide the fact that spring had come, and there was no more snow to help him guard David, he would call in the police. That would be the end. They would come and take him back to camp. David stared into the darkness. He would never get away, never. The bar was as thick as a tree trunk, and it would take him many, many nights to hack through it with his knife, and the farmer would see where he had worked at it the very first morning. God of the green pastures and still waters, why have you done it? Asked David. What have I done wrong? I rescued Maria from the fire and saved her life so that I could thank you, and all through this long winter I haven't once caused you any trouble, though I have sometimes thought they were bad people you brought me to. But I haven't complained, and I haven't asked you to make it better, though I've got two lots of help left over from the last time with Maria. You must know the farmer and his family are bad people, and I hate them. And I thought perhaps it was you who got Signora Hartmann to paint me so that I could find the picture of the woman who was my mother. I chose you, and I can't alter that now. But I want you to know that I think you're cruel, just like the farmer here and Carlo and all that belong to them. And I suppose you'll never help me again, even if I do have some help still to come, because you're tired of me. I'm sorry I didn't choose a better God. I am David. Amen. David felt a little better now. It was good to get it off his chest. Then he began to feel frightened. Suppose God grew terribly angry when he was criticized. Suppose he kept hostages just as they did. Then some harm might befall Maria. He couldn't do very much to David but let him die. Oh, yes, worse than that. He could let him be taken back to the camp and make him live there. But it would be worse still if he did anything to Maria. But it was true. He was cruel. David had waited patiently all winter and put up with things without complaining and whimpering, and then God let the farmer bar the door, and it was only a nightmare that David could get away. It was only at night time that David could get away. David wasted 2 precious nights before he realized where the trouble lay. And he might have known right away, for Johannes had once told him. They had heard one of the guards put the blame for some neglect of duty on another who had retorted that it was the fault of a third man, and Johannes had said to David, "Never let me say it's someone else's fault. It often is, but you must never shirk your own responsibility. There's always something where you're at fault, too, and that fault you must discover and learn to recognize and take the consequences of it, both because it's the only honorable thing to do and also because it's the easier way. You can't change others, but you can do something about a fault in yourself." He had told God plainly what the fault was. He had said God was cruel like Carlo and the farmer and all bad people, when perhaps God just wanted to teach him where his own fault lay. He had been cruel himself. He was not the only one who had waited patiently without complaining. Carlo had too, and David had taken no notice. Carlo had said he was sorry several times, and David had refused to forgive him for being bad. But suppose Carlo was not really bad. Suppose he were only rather stupid. He had never tried to get even because David would not talk to him while he was in the house. On the contrary, the children's mother had told their father that Carlo had done his utmost to be good friends with David, and had been very upset when David would not respond. David sat up in the darkness. He must get away from here. There must be some way, and he would have to find it. He remembered the address of the house. He could write a letter and buy a stamp. If he let himself remain a prisoner, Carlo would never get to know that David had discovered he was not perhaps really bad at all, but only stupid. The door was impossible, and the window was too small. But if Spring were not in too great a hurry to come up the mountainside, then he might be able to take advantage of the snow. He could cut a hole in the stable wall in the end farthest from the house, so that no one would hear him at work, and then dig a tunnel through the snow, which lay piled up to the roof, so get out that way some distance from the house. During the days that followed, David was so sleepy in the daytime that he made a mess of everything. He had to stay awake all night in order to get on with his plan. Fortunately, the stable was a wooden building. His knife grew blunter and blunter, but at last he managed to hack out a big square hole large enough to get through. He replaced the loose boards every morning and put a bucket in front of them so that the farmer should not discover the hole. Then he began digging out the snow. The bucket came in handy, and he emptied the snow he dug into the beast's drinking trough. David thought what a good thing it was the farmer was so stupid, or he would certainly have wondered why the animals were no longer thirsty. However, it was a bigger job than David had imagined, and he had to get a little sleep every night. He was very much afraid spring would come too early and the snow begin to thaw, perhaps even collapse on top of him in the tunnel. He was also afraid that in the end the farmer would begin to ask himself why David was so sleepy in the daytime instead of just grumbling at him. He still kept his hands off him. One day he was just going to strike him, but stopped abruptly when the dog placed himself in front of David and stood there growling. David was puzzled, but when he realized the dog was ready to protect him against the farmer, he went into the stable and cried. He had no idea why, but he seemed overcome by the thought that a creature wanted to protect him, although he had done nothing to deserve it. That very evening David overheard the farmer tell his wife that the youngster would have to be handed over to the police right away because he had gotten a hold on the dog. What silly, wicked nonsense, David thought angrily. He had never had a hold over anybody, or ever wanted to have, and if he ever got such a hold without being able to help it, he would not make use of it. A hold over others, brute force, violence, that was all they ever thought of. He would have to get away that night. The tunnel was twice his own length. He did not know if it were long enough, but it would have to do. He had no more time. When it was dark and the farmer and his family were at supper, David slipped out and thrust a long broomstick through the snow behind the stable, just where he reckoned the tunnel ended. Half the broomstick struck out of the snow. That meant he would be able to get through that night, but it also meant that if the farmer spotted the stick, he would undoubtedly guess what David was up to. David waited with beating heart for the farmer's footsteps when he came to bar the door. Would he take a walk around now that it was no longer snowing? But the farmer went straight in again. It was still very cold out. David fought down his feeling of nausea. He always felt like being sick when he had been most frightened, but that night he had no time to stop. He wouldn't be sick, but he was in spite of that. The dog was uneasy that evening. First it lay watching him as he worked at the tunnel, its eyes shining in the dark, and then it tried to help him with the digging, trotting back and forth and forward and scrabbling in the snow, just where David was going to put the bucket. After a bit he got the idea of placing both of his forepaws on the bucket and pushing so that it bit into the snow more easily. It whined a little now and then and followed David with its eyes while he was looking for his bundle and packing things together. Fortunately, there had been nothing in it the farmer could find a use for. He had gone through it and thrown it back to David when he had seen what was in it. David tidied himself up as well as he could in the darkness and carefully disentangled Maria's cross, which he had tied firmly inside the belt of his trousers so that he should not lose it. As he fastened the chain around his neck, he said softly to the dog, "I must go now. Thank you for keeping me so warm at night, King, but most of all for wanting to protect me against them. I've never known what it was like for someone to want to protect me. Goodbye." He took a firm hold of the dog's thick, warm neck and laid his head against it, and King licked him enthusiastically around the chin. Then David crawled into the tunnel until he came to the hole he had made by wiggling the broomstick around. The dog followed him, but David said, "No, King, you must stay here where you get food every day. Goodbye." And so he was out in the open. It was still very, very cold. By listening to the conversation of the farmer and his wife, he had found out how to get down to the road that wound on through the mountains, and perhaps it would not be quite so cold farther down, now that spring was on its way. It was already April. David hurried along as fast as he dared. The night was still and clear enough for him to see where he was going. An hour passed, and half scrambling, half walking down to where the road should be, and then he saw it. Men had begun to clear it to make way through the snow, but it would be some time yet before a car could drive along it. David was able to walk in the cleared part without too much difficulty, and the going would soon be easier, for he knew he was high up in the neighborhood of a pass called the St. Goddard, and farther down spring would be more advanced. He looked back over his shoulder at the white mountain. Winter had come to an end at last, and he had his freedom once more. He was glad he had discovered the meaning of the barred door. Everything had gone smoothly since then. Yes, he had made a good choice after all, when he had chosen the God of green pastures and still waters. He was very powerful, and the fact that he expected you to think for yourself and do something in return for his help did not matter as long as you could work things out. David did not know how long he had been aware of the dark dot up on the mountainside. It was moving toward him. He was not yet free. He turned and ran. The moon was shining now. If he could reach the turn of the road where it swept around a spur of rock, he might be able to dig himself into the snow before the farmer arrived on the scene. David never knew how he managed to do it. Everything went black in front of his eyes as he lay in the snow. Then a warm, wet feeling on his face woke him up. It was not the farmer after all. It was the dog who wanted to go with him. It trotted along by his side, sometimes running up ahead, but always returning to keep him company, and every time he spoke to it, it would wag its tail. David breathed deeply, hardly noticing the cold bite in the air. He was David. He was free and strong. He was on the move again, but this time he knew where he was making for. There might be many difficulties ahead before he reached his goal, but difficulties could be overcome. He still had one more promise of help left over from God, and he had the dog who was going with him of its own free will. The long winter had passed, and he was going down to meet the spring. Thank you. So tomorrow we'll read chapter